This video is an analysis of the rebuild of Evangelion, but focuses largely on the concluding fourth film. I made this video because I see a lot of criticism about Rebuild, some of which is fair, and others seem to be far too biased toward the original series and End of Evangelion. I agree with general criticisms around Rebuild's visual style not being as great, the excessive fan service, and so on. And a lot of people have said that Rebuild has no justification to exist or feels meaningless compared to what was already accomplished in the previous entries. And while I partially agree with that, I also think that that type of take is only the half-truth that stems from the biases I was talking about. Yes, Evangelion, the TV show, and End of Evangelion by themselves form a completed narrative already, and they're great. But for what it's worth, I really dislike the sudden and ambiguous nature of both of these endings, especially the TV ending. It was only after further reflection and a viewing of End of Evangelion that I came to value the existence of both of these endings together. Evangelion's multiple endings make it feel like a video game, with branching narratives, all of which are meant to point to a similar general message about the world or the universe, but from a different point of view. The message ultimately being that Shinji must learn to affirm himself through coexistence with others, and that he must not run away from others, and that his desire for understanding and acknowledgement entails a risk of disappointment and requires constant renegotiation with those around him. All of these lessons are wonderfully told in a moving narrative, and it's no wonder why people have had their lives so deeply affected by Evangelion. And from somebody who watched it for the first time as an adult with no expectations, I found its exhortations to still be very moving, but ultimately hollow. To put it shortly, the TV series ends with Shinji having these epiphanies and he gets a round of applause. In End of Evangelion, Shinji struggles violently and ends with another psychedelic experience that leaves him with the same insights, but the end of the world has already happened. The End of Evangelion is a tragedy with a message that doesn't seem to fit the tragic nature of its ending. It reminds me of a famous take that philosopher Slavoj Žižek once told about V for Vendetta, where he said that he would sell his mother to slavery or something fucked up like that in order to see what happens after the final events of the story. What happens the day after a violent revolution? In the same nature, we can ask what happens after the day of the end of the world. And maybe it's because I viewed it as an adult in the midst of a world crisis, but the metaphysical mind trips only sold half the message for me. How can a teenage boy learn to embrace others, but the final scenes of its TV series and its movie are ultimately depictions of more of the same vagueness and desolation that fans have endured throughout the narrative. Critiquing Evangelion is a real ballbuster because there's multiple reasons people fall in love with the series. We love it for its visual aesthetic, we love it because we saw ourselves in these characters struggling with themes of the human condition like loneliness and anxiety, and the franchise has this almost transcendent aura around it in the pop cultural zeitgeist that invites both personal confessions of admiration as well as intellectual dissecting of it. While I love Evangelion, I'm also grateful I didn't watch it during my own adolescent years where I struggled with life as well. Because now as an adult, I get to view it with a bored adult perspective that's been beaten down by realities like taxes and jobs and commuting to jobs and empty speeches from beloved politicians and airborne illnesses that have flu-like symptoms and paying rent every month, and I'll stop bitching here, but you get the point. So this video is just another analysis of the famous and beloved franchise, but it is an analysis of said franchise's less celebrated parts because I believe there is more to appreciate about Eva if we just slow down and analyze it with a more charitable scope. I know, asking people on the internet to think twice before they hate on something? Yeah, I think I've already lost you. For those who have stayed, I really hope that this video comes off as a fair and intellectually inviting take on the Rebuild series, so you can walk away thinking about this film beyond what it made you feel at some point in your life. The Rebuild films do suck in a lot of ways, but I think that the concept of Rebuild is actually pretty good compared to the actual execution of Rebuild. And it is still a monumental effort from Anno and all who have worked on it to deliver something both nostalgic and refreshing. Oh, and also, Mari is better than Rei and Asuka. Like I can't even wrap my head around the fact that people for 20 plus years actually debated between a girl who is borderline abusive to Shinji or the other girl who doesn't talk and doesn't do anything and oh yeah, is a clone of his fucking mom. That's really just one thing that gets on my nerves, but it kind of represents the whole issue at hand with the Evangelion fanbase and Evangelion as a franchise. It's just that there's a whole series of remake movies, and for better or worse, they may not be the ideal film remakes that fans wanted. It just sucks that it seems like a lot of people criticize the movie, but don't necessarily see the potential and deeper underlying meaning of the movie. So that's why we're having this video. Evangelion is a franchise that began in 1996. That's nearly 30 years ago. And to this day, people sing praises about the initial show from the 90s for its amazing visual aesthetic, its depiction of existential angst, and a variety of other factors, such as the fact that Hideaki Anno, the show's creator, asked for like 26 versions of Fly Me to the Moon to end each individual episode on. When I first watched the show, I didn't have any idea what I was getting myself into, and all I really knew was that I heard the show was really strange, and yeah, that totally checked out. I first watched the show in 2020 during the medical mask fashion meta that took the world by storm. To avoid getting caught in all of that hype, I stayed inside my dorm to binge watch TV shows and retain some semblance of sanity. In hindsight, while watching TV to preserve your sanity is already a dubious strategy, watching Evangelion is like playing Russian roulette with your mental health. But in the end, I am glad I discovered Evangelion. The show tackles themes like depression and alienation in a time when anime was supposed to be all glittery and flashy kid shows. But it wasn't just the sobering depiction of animated characters going through the same psychological problems and trauma that we all go through that made it so interesting. Evangelion made a great aesthetic effort to blend all of its rich influences together, pairing animation with philosophy, psychoanalysis, and theology. The show's attempts to feed its viewers philosophy sometimes come off like that one freshman in your class who tries way too hard to prove that he actually did the readings unlike everybody else. And by that I mean the show will word vomit spontaneously a stew of lore intermixed with philosophical lines that don't make much sense without context. But all in all, the lasting effect that the TV series and End of Evangelion has had on its fan base are numerous and very clear. But even as the final movie in the Rebuild film series is completed, it has come out with middling reception, with some people hating or ignoring the film remakes for the exact same reasons that others might praise or celebrate it. So you might be wondering, if we already have the original TV series, which was great and monumental, and we have End of Evangelion, which people praise as a masterpiece, and rightfully so, why am I arguing for the significance of the Rebuild series? To understand why I'm arguing for the Rebuild series, we have to talk about what SEKAIKEI is first. Evangelion is often considered the grandfather of SEKAIKEI. You can call SEKAIKEI like an umbrella term, a subgenre, a category, or a style of storytelling that developed through anime, manga, and some would even say video games. Defining SEKAIKEI is kind of hard because critics and thinkers have debated on what a SEKAIKEI work even hinges on, and they've never really come to an agreed consensus. Stephanie Thomas, in her paper titled SEKAIKEI as Existentialist Grand Narrative, proposes a philosophical framework that highlights the genre's emphasis on self-affirmation, existential anxiety and despair, authentic existence, and intersubjectivity. Now, that's a lot of big words, but aside from the references to existentialism, there are other general indicators that all viewers can observe without a degree in philosophy and massive student debt. In SEKAIKEI, the characters are typically young people thrust into a world catastrophe where their actions determine the fate of humanity. And it's usually not a very happy or adventurous affair. Evangelion, for example, deconstructs the mecha genre by showing people that operating a giant robotic weapon of mass destruction isn't exactly a teenager's idea of the best job ever. Shinji is almost never happy about being chosen to save humanity, and unlike the typical shonen story where the main character is a morally righteous and sometimes goofy hero, Shinji is your typical teenager who just wants to bull out with friends, be loved by his father, and sometimes struggles with depressive thoughts. Instead of getting what he wants though, Shinji is instead forced by his father to pilot the Eva, the same way that a sports-obsessed father might force his theater geek of a son into playing football. Shinji's position as the protagonist is often portrayed not as a desirable one, but a burden which he actively runs away from. He oscillates between authentically choosing to pilot the Eva, or doing it just for the sake of acceptance from people like his father. And if we're still going off of Evangelion alone, then SEKAIKEI works typically have these utterly crazy story premises that contrast with the brutal realities of growing up, relationships, and the occasional feeling of anxiety and hopelessness that we talked about earlier. Evangelion throws its characters to fight mysterious beings that are destructive without rational or humanly understandable motive. This representation of a cosmic force is like a manifestation of the universe's irrationality and absurdity, which often manifests in our own everyday, non-robot piloting lives. You could catch a train to work one day, and just like spring allergies, or a sudden epiphany, or a skyscraper-sized organic thing that screams hyperbeams around the city, life suddenly becomes stricken with a sense of hopelessness and meaninglessness. On the flip side, even the members of humanity who are fighting these creatures sometimes seem impenetrable, flawed, unable to be vulnerable with one another when they need each other the most. This sandwiching of the young pilots between what appear to be mysterious alien creatures and more mysterious alien creatures that just look more like them is a representation of the common ways which people fall into alienation with society, with loved ones, with themselves, and learn to retreat from the world as the only way to survive. Like the existentialist thinkers, Anno created a work which explores humanity's encounters with the situations and themes like the absurd, despair, faith, identity, coexistence, and so on. It's no wonder that in an age where people are increasingly connected and disconnected, where our exploitation of each other are exposed to us to the point of desensitization, where our systems are being critiqued for their failures to maintain better societies and face the looming ecological crises, I'm saying a lot of random shit right now, that a story about young people who are enlisted to work for shitty adults with giant monsters tearing up their cities is still kind of popular with young people to this day. And it is the success of Evangelion which propelled its narrative formula into the mainstream in the early 2000s. There was an Eva boom consisting of stories which featured similar narrative notes to Evangelion, and of course these products of the Eva boom later formed the body of media that would be considered SEKAIKEI. SEKAIKEI grew alongside the socio-economic turmoil of Japan and the post-modernization of culture and media across the world. Now, being the person who values intellectual integrity like I am, I didn't just read one random paper on Google. I actually read 2 random papers on Google. According to Motoko Tanaka, these real-world conditions gave birth to the apocalyptic imagination known as SEKAIKEI. The problem with the apocalyptic imagination that fuels SEKAIKEI works is that they had limitations within their own narrative structures. Tanaka's critique and formulation of SEKAIKEI is not without dispute, as Stephanie Thomas actually disagrees with her notion that SEKAIKEI does not allow for change through growth. However, the idea of a changeless post-apocalypse where a lack of intersubjectivity and otherness prevents sustainable communities and societies to form is very fitting for describing the premise of Evangelion. Once again, this limitation brings us back to the idea of intersubjectivity. Basically, it's the ability for others to relate to you and for others to perceive one another and recognize that they live in a shared reality. It is the lack of such a depiction following the conclusion of the original series that made it feel hollow to me. While Evangelion does not represent all of SEKAIKEI, it is a major cornerstone of the SEKAIKEI category. and that's why it is important to see how Rebuild's narrative diverges and addresses the limitations of SEKAIKEI. So where do we go from here? I mean, Shinji and Gendo have basically become like master speedrunners for initiating human instrumentality and screwing over the rest of the world. And in Rebuild alone, Shinji triggers the end of the world like basically 3 or 4 times. From ambiguous metaphysics to hauntingly beautiful or just another Monday in New Tokyo. To keep the narrative trudging, we've practically seen it all. And what lies at the narrative horizon at the end of this unexplored region where SEKAIKEI supposedly fails to venture into? So by the 4th movie, we get a depiction of the post-apocalypse that seems to clearly diverge from the others. Rather than showing the aftermath in beautifully bleak fashion like End of Evangelion for example, the first act of Thrice Upon a Time has Shinji and Reikyu settled in the village of survivors, where we see some of the supporting cast including Toji and Kensuke. Crucially, Toji and Kensuke have now grown up and have found a way to integrate with society, both playing important roles for the village's survival. When I saw this, for me, it was a grounding of the very intersubjectivity that was sorely missed in the daily lives of our characters from the previous Evangelion entries. Toji and Kensuke's social roles are examples of integrating into society. Toji and Kensuke in their adulthood contrast starkly with the appearance of Shinji, who, stricken with the curse of Eva, cannot grow physically and has been so emotionally and psychologically stunted from piloting the Eva that he initially cannot fathom the essential vitality of everything outside of fighting or obeying orders. It's kind of like me when I finally graduated from college and I looked at everything like, wow, what do I do from here? I don't have class, I don't have readings, I don't have homework. Where am I gonna find food? Where's the dining halls again? But seriously, the shared interactions that Toji and Kensuke have with Shinji give him the encouragement and forgiveness he needs to finally reckon with his personal grief and guilt. But let's go back to the things that Tanaka has said about SEKAIKEI in her paper. From a more sociological perspective, we see what Tanaka notes as a communal space where social norms and ideologies can be shared. In the village, everybody has a role to play that directly contributes to the survival and the fight against Nerve. The new organization introduced in the 3rd movie, known as Will, acts as a new de facto government, which provides tools to halt the cataclysm, military defense, and distributes and organizes resources so that the villages can thrive. Earlier I said that Toji and Kensuke help Shinji move on from his trauma. Similarly, many of the civilians in the village interact with Reikyu and help her establish her sense of identity by giving her a new outfit, by giving her chores to do, and teaching her how to display her emotions properly like a real waifu. All of these point to the depiction of a communal space and a middle ground, as mentioned by Tanaka, which allows for people to share ideologies, establish social norms, and remain connected to each other through collective identity and struggle. What's really cool about the side characters in Thrice Upon a Time is they're not as one-note as before. Many of them are not just relegated to staring at computer screens and gibbering off panicky jargon while Shinji is getting dunked on by the villain of the week. In summary, the overall message that tells you it's important to be surrounded by people who care about you, and only through coexisting with other individuals can your sense of individuality come out, still holds strong in the Rebuild series. What makes Thrice Upon a Time unique is that we have this message followed by an ending that does not have ambiguous post-apocalyptic vibes. And as an icing on the cake, Shinji, in his newfound maturity, realizes that the way to saving the world is not by beating Gendo. Gendo is insufferable as ever with more complicated jargon that nobody understands, but Shinji sees through all of that and gives his father the first vibe check he's ever had and very much needed in many years, showing that at the heart of it, Gendo is suffering and grieving like Shinji was, but Gendo, rather than gaining the aid of others and processing his grief, managed to bag all that shit up for decades and use it as motivation to end humanity. But even he admits the craving intimacy from others in his own ways. That's why he sought to be together with his wife again by dissolving AT fields with instrumentality. But Gendo failed to realize that if he had just attained some meaningful intersubjective relations with those around him, aka making some real friends or bonding with his only son, that could have saved him a lot of heartache and taxpayer money, which was spent on funding evil government science projects. From an existentialist lens, Shinji makes an authentic choice to take on the responsibility of confronting his father. This willingness to make such a choice and no longer anxiously shirk away from saving the world like a college student procrastinating his papers is only possible following the first act of the film. Unlike previous iterations of Shinji where we saw him flip-flop between depression riding the subway or being coerced into fighting angels by other people or by destructive circumstances, this version of Shinji seems to express a self-assuredness that would resemble Heidegger's notion of authentically being, or in his own words, having a definite character in terms of their own most potentiality for being their selves. Yeah, try putting that on an inspiration board. What I hope to do with this video was bring a deeper perspective on the changes made in the Rebuild series. As popular as Evangelion is, I'm sure I'm not the only one who was confused with the previous entries' somewhat ambiguous endings, which have always been a part of their appeal and a source of frustration. And I'm not trying to say that a clearer and happier ending is always needed for a show or a movie to drive home its messages. We have many films with open-ended endings or close with ambiguous scenes that add more to the work itself. I just feel like there were many things about the endings to Evangelion that never seemed quite right. Whether it be the sudden drop-off between episode 23 and 24 and 25, or the exhortation for self-affirmation and intersubjectivity, followed by a depiction of desolation and post-apocalypse, which fails to endorse Anno's message directly, unless we interpret Shinji's story as a tragic, cautionary tale. I think that Thrice Upon a Time's ending, when supplemented with the context of the original series, examines more sides to the recurring themes and questions that Evangelion has explored for the longest time. Does consuming apocalyptic media really help us visualize the future and examine the conditions of our current world? And even if a piece of work is so artful and groundbreaking that it garners mass appeal, can it ever do more than simply bring awareness to an issue in society? Does Thrice Upon a Time succeed in reimagining SEKAIKEI, demonstrating that the genre can show positive themes and imagine an end to the end of the world? To me, it is far from perfect in execution. But when I watched Shinji finally get out of the cycle of destruction and suffering that Anno has created for him and that we couldn't get enough of, I just felt happy. It felt well deserved. And by the end of it all, I didn't care for the lore so much, nor whether it could ever achieve a masterpiece status, nor whether Mari was based on Anno's wife, nor any of the other miscellaneous questions that came. I simply felt relief, like I had just played a game with multiple endings, multiple times, and finally landed on a happy ending for my character. And they are all contingent events in the universe that show what happens with grief and trauma and loneliness and existing in a world that feels harsh and alien. Anybody who relates to Evangelion has likely felt those things at one point. Thrice Upon a Time treads over much of the same stuff and goes to tell us a little more. Don't just be like Shinji and sulk and grieve. We all need people around us, a community, even if it is difficult to find one. Even watching Evangelion over and over can be a form of escapism. We have to go out and establish relationships with other people, not just individuals, but other people. And then we have to learn to exist among the world and these other beings. We can only become individuals if we interact with others and do things and create things without excessively worrying about the meaning or the purpose of something. We can't look to others to just cure our loneliness and our past traumas, because then we will fail to look at them as individuals. And it creates a whole feedback loop where we are all misinterpreting and being misinterpreted. But regardless, the world will hurt us and break us in many ways, but we grow a little more in those ways. It's a part of growing up. This video essay was the first one I've ever created, so forgive me if it went all over the place and my voiceovers fell off, or there wasn't enough philosophy or intellectual thoughts, or too much philosophy. I'm still trying to find my groove with this, and I want to make more video essays on media that people love and articulate why we love it. So thanks for watching. I don't know if I'm done analyzing things from Evangelion, but I've spent a year on and off looking at Evangelion, and at some point I started asking myself if I even care about Evangelion anymore, so I'll have to come back to this at some point, but thanks for watching.